So tired of the street line, and everywhere you turn there's vultures and thieves at your back. The storm keeps on twisting, you keep on building the lies that you make up for all that you lack. It don't make no difference, escape for one last time. It's easier to believe in this sweet madness, all this glorious sadness that brings me to my knees.
From our perspective, sex trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people by means of coercion to achieve the consent of the persons being controlled for the purpose of exploitation. The consent of a victim is irrelevant. The lure for victims can include the promise of a good job, a false marriage proposal, the sale of a victim by family members, or outright kidnapping. This is illustrated in this video about sex trafficking in Mexico.
In Mexico, impunity is rampant. Organized groups and opportunists lie to their victims, telling them they'll live a life of riches and then exploit them, making roughly between $150 to $250 every day. They exploit human beings to obtain economic benefits, turning human beings into slaves.
Often the victims are subjected to debt bondage, starvation, beatings, rape, traumatic injury, addiction to drugs or alcohol, sexually transmitted diseases, psychological harm, and traumatic bonding.
Victims are usually women and children, but include boys as well, and most are in their teens, the average age being 12 to 14. This video is an example of one child victim in our own city of Phoenix.
There's a harvest each Saturday night at the bars filled with perfume and hitching a ride. A place you could stand for one night and get gone. And it's clear this conversation ain't doing a thing, 'cause these boys only listen to me when I sing. And I don't feel like singing tonight all the same songs. Hearing these deep city lights, a girl could get lost tonight. I'm finding every reason to be gone. There's nothing here to hold on to. Could I hold you? The situation's always the same. You've got your wolves in their clothes, whispering Hollywood's name, stealing gold from the silver they see, but it's not me. Deep city lights, a girl could get lost tonight. I'm finding every reason to be gone. There's nothing here to hold on to. Could I hold
This issue is personal to us because we are prime targets as teenagers living in Phoenix, a hotspot for sex trafficking in the U.S. In addition, we personally know women who have been approached as targets. Our friend, whose father works at the police squad that picks up prostitutes from off the street, was walking in a park one day while she was babysitting. A man approached her, saying he was a photographer of teen models. He told her his studio was just the next street over if she was interested. Thankfully, she said no. When she told her father what had happened, they looked up his website from the card he gave her, and it was obvious that he was not a legitimate teen model photographer, as all of his pictures were of pets and families.
Our knowledge issue is the question, is sex trafficking acceptable? The knowledge claim that we will be assessing is that sex trafficking is unacceptable. Through the perception given to us by morals and values ingrained in us by United States media, cultural values, and international regulations, we reason that sex trafficking, or any other kind of slavery, is wrong and unacceptable. Unfortunately, though our culture strongly disagrees with human bondage, sex trafficking still occurs throughout the world, even in the United States. Our cultural values, such as the strong emphasis on individual liberty, biases us against seeing sex trafficking as acceptable. But we understand that other cultures may not have these same values. We will be investigating this conflict of acceptable versus unacceptable, and investigating the counterclaim that sex trafficking might not be as unacceptable as we see it.
Before we begin assessing these claims, we need to create some operational definitions. Sex trafficking has previously been defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people by means of coercion to achieve the consent of persons being controlled for the purpose of exploitation. The consent of the victim is irrelevant. Unacceptable for the purpose of this presentation is operationally defined as anything that detracts from society more than it helps the individual. Acceptable, conversely, is operationally defined as anything that benefits the individual more than it harms society. We will be examining this knowledge issue through the lenses of perception and reason using the areas of human sciences, history, religion, and ethics.
Sex trafficking victims suffer both mental and physical abuse and are subjected to a practice that is perceived to be ethically wrong in our society. In a society where personal freedoms and liberties are so highly valued, the thought of being unwillingly forced to do anything, especially something of a sexual nature, is repugnant and unthinkable. With our historic struggles against slavery and bondage, how could we ever condone such actions? The psychological and physical damage inflicted only makes the atrocities worse. However, to avoid ethical imperialism, in which we impose our ethical values on others living in different societies under different ethical paradigms, we must address the counterclaim. Why would anyone consider sex trafficking as acceptable? Well, to understand why, we first have to consider the motivations or the reasoning behind the victims of sex trafficking. Many of the trafficking victims operate under a false dilemma of reasoning that shows them only two options for survival: death by starvation and poverty, or sex trafficking. Many of the victims of sex trafficking are sold into slavery by family for money because of the poor economic conditions of the country. For example, in Yemen and Palestine, many families sell off their daughters for early marriage, a form of sex trafficking, in return for some compensation which will allow them to put food on the table. In Cambodia, 47% of victims are sold into sex slavery by their mothers. In addition, the majority of the population is under 20, and with a high unemployment rate, there's a large amount of cross-border migration of the target age group. This leads to a high vulnerability for becoming a victim of sex trafficking. In many countries, especially in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, the targeted areas are poverty-stricken, and the victims are lured by the promise of wage labor in a wealthier part of the country or in another country altogether. When the laborers arrive at their destination, they are enslaved and often used for commercial sex, the company claiming the women and girls are indebted to them and must work off their debt. This is commonly called debt bondage. The promise of work is also why sex trafficking rates are highest in third world countries.
However, there are two problems with this reasoning. First, sex trafficking is not an economically viable way to survive, as families are only paid a one-time fee for selling their wives or children, and most of the money stays with traffickers. Only a small portion reaches the victims. Second, there are other options for survival for the impoverished, such as shelters and aid organizations, which provide shelter and food to the poverty-stricken, as well as skills to help them get jobs. Families can turn to organizations such as CARE, which focuses on strengthening the abilities of impoverished women so that they have a stronger capacity for self-help and can support their families. Or they can turn to organizations like Food for the Hungry, UNESCO, and USAID.
Disasters and emergency situations, such as the Iraq War, cause economic determinism and create higher propensities of sex trafficking. These events have made women and children more vulnerable to sex trafficking due to either economic upheavals that lead to unemployment or loss of their means of support through loss of a male figure. Women again fall into the false dilemma of reasoning and reason that, because they have no ethical way of supporting themselves, they have no other option but to take part in sex trafficking as a victim to survive. Right now, in Syria alone, 50,000 Iraqi refugee girls and women, many of them widows, have been forced into prostitution because they have lost their means of support due to the war. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge held power for a long time, and many of the cities were deserted due to the regime. When the regime rapidly ended, many people flocked into the cities again. Due to the instability of the economy and the country as a whole at this time, many women fell into sex trafficking as a way to support themselves. A recent example of this trend can be seen during the turmoil of the earthquake in Haiti.
Today we are focusing on Haiti, a country that, as most of you know, is suffering after a devastating earthquake. Haiti was also suffering before as the poorest country in the Americas. Haiti fought for their independence from France in 1804. Since then, their country's government has been a calamity of corruption. A violent military coup in 2004, which displaced Prime Minister Aristide, assured the country's political instability. Haiti has become a poverty-stricken country with one of the highest rates of HIV/AIDS anywhere in the world. Then, on January 12th of this year, a 7.0 earthquake propelled this country into even deeper despair. Traffickers love natural disasters. The chaos, destruction, and loss that an earthquake or tsunami cause are breeding grounds for traffickers to swoop in and prey on bewildered victims. With the promise of help, rescue, and jobs in other countries, traffickers are able to lure victims into the sex trade. A country like Haiti that is already poverty-stricken and had an existing rape and sex trafficking problem, a natural disaster only increases this vulnerability.